Hi, everybody. I'm Joan. Welcome to the Early Childhood Seminar Series. And today we're really lucky to have Carl Rosengren talk to us. He's a faculty member in the psychology department, and he does work in many areas, I'm learning. And one is children's understanding of death. And we had talked about this, he and I had talked about this last year. He presented about a completely different topic. But this was kind of a curious topic for a person interested in development. But I think it's a topic that I've often felt stuck with, working with children and families, how to talk about death. And we don't talk about it generally in our culture much until we have to make arrangements for somebody. But it's interesting to think about this from different cultural perspectives, why it is such a difficult topic for our society, what other societies might think about the concept of death. So with that said, I'll let Carl explain the research he's done cross-culturally.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. So I don't know if it was the topic or the election or whatever, but or my tie that scared people off. But anyway, I'm glad you're here. And also feel free to ask questions and other kinds of things as we go along. So I want to talk a little bit about why people are interested in this topic, and it's really been looked at from two very, very different perspectives. One is obviously a clinical perspective with the idea of how can we help children who are dealing with death kind of cope with it. And interestingly, that's based on a cognitive developmental perspective that I'll get into in a minute. But then a lot of researchers who are cognitive developmentalists, and I mostly study cognitive and motor development, are also interested in trying to see how children reason about death as a biological phenomena. And then I want to briefly kind of talk a little bit about why I got interested in this, because this was kind of about a 10-year diversion from stuff that I normally do. And it all was triggered by a horrible, horrible event that happened in Champaign-Urbana when my wife and I were down there on the faculty. And our youngest daughter was in a Montessori preschool. And I was away giving a talk, and I got a phone call from my wife whether I'd heard, and asked me if I'd heard this news. And the news was that one of my daughter's best friends was picked up from the Montessori school, and he was stabbed 50 times and left for dead. His older brother had already been killed by his mother, and that sort of triggered a community-wide reaction. And when I got back from my trip, we had a whole number of kind of emergency parent-teacher meetings over this weekend. And I was sitting in the group listening to parents talk about how they wanted to take their children out of the school because they didn't want to confront this. I heard clinical social workers talk about how children couldn't understand death. And they were basically talking about death from kind of a 1950s Piagetian perspective. And as someone who knows a lot about cognitive development, I thought this was not, in fact, necessarily accurate. And the boy, who's actually alive and 21, actually survived, and about a month and a half later went back to the school. And then a whole bunch of other parents took their kids out because they didn't want them to talk to him. And if you think about that from the emotional health of the child, that's probably the worst thing in the world for him. What he needed was kind of support of his friends. And so one of the things that this kind of set me up doing was basically recruiting a whole bunch of people to help me try to kind of think broadly about how we in this culture think about death and talk to children about death and what children really do understand about death, and to look at it from a kind of broader perspective than people had traditionally done in the field of cognitive development. And also to try to bring in, so I brought in an expert on social emotional development, Peggy Miller, who does work in a much more qualitative way. And then we ended up basically taking this research down to Mexico and trying to understand how a culture that's completely different from ours might kind of think about death and what that means for children. So that's in a nutshell sort of why I got going on this, and it's really, and I'm still working some in this area. So basically from this clinical perspective, the focus is all on children's coping. Coping with a loved one or coping with their own potentially upcoming death. There's quite a bit of work that's been done in children's hospitals with children that are chronically ill. And actually I went out to Seattle Children's Hospital at one point and gave a 2-day talk. I basically gave the long version of the talk I'm giving today. And a lot of that's focused on emotional aspects. And there's an amazing amount of literature that talks about children's anxiety about death and fear about death. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that actually very few typically developing children exhibit any kind of fear of death. I think this is mostly an adult issue in our culture, and I think it's kind of sort of made greater because we don't talk about it. We're not open about it, and I'll come back to that. And so it's often really looked at from clinical populations and therapeutic settings. And one of the things that this literature generally does is it emphasizes young children's lack of understanding of what death is and lack of emotional and coping skills. That's one thing I'm going to argue is not true. And a lot of this is based on Piaget's view. So a lot of the clinical work goes back to work of Piaget, who did a lot of the groundbreaking work on child development. And he really argued that children couldn't really understand death until they were about 9 or 10. And part of it, he argued that they couldn't distinguish fantasy and reality. And this is actually the work that the kind of information that I heard when I was sitting in on these meetings with these clinical social workers and teachers and stuff. And basically the last 20 years of research in cognitive development has basically said that Piaget didn't really have the timeline right and that children are a lot more competent. So I was sitting in the audience both being kind of trying to figure out how to talk to my own child, but also thinking we know that children are a lot more competent than that. And I think one of the things, if you think that children lack both the cognitive understanding and the emotional understanding, then you're going to try to avoid it, even after a horrible situation like this. But one of the things I'm going to argue is that we can't avoid talking about it. Around the same time, there was a kindergarten in Urbana, a public kindergarten, where the kindergarten teacher had a heart attack and died right in the class. And the kids were in the classroom for at least an hour with the teacher having died. So, we can act like it doesn't happen and that we can avoid it, but we could also kind of maybe talk a little bit about it more. So, this is a busy slide, but basically a lot of people from a cognitive perspective are really interested in trying to understand death from a biological perspective. And it's often couched in this kind of theory approach where the idea is that children are constructing theories about the world, and one area that people think people develop theories is in the domain of biology. And Alison Gopnik is coming to psychology later on in the semester, I think first week in December, and she's actually one of the big proponents of this theory approach. The idea of a child as a scientist who basically is a heck of a lot more competent than Piaget thought. And most of the recent work has talked a lot about children being more competent than Piaget thought. And they've often tried to look at this in emotionally sort of situations where there's not much emotion. So Simone Wynn, who was a former graduate student of mine, Susan Gelman, looked at death in plants. It turns out death in plants is kind of a strange thing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And there was some important work by Spiess and Brent that basically said what we should really be looking at is not death overall, but a number of important subconcepts. So they talked quite a bit about And there's been a whole lot of research now on these particular key subconcepts. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that children, even as young as 3.5, have some kind of understanding of these subconcepts. And that's basically universality, the idea that all living things die at some point; irreversibility or finality, the idea that death can't be reversed; non-functionality, that the body no longer functions, and often this is looked at from both a psychological perspective, the idea that all psychological function ends at death, or from a biological perspective, the idea that all biological function, eating, and all that kind of stuff, breathing. And causality, which is actually a little bit more complicated. It's the idea that children understand that you just don't get old and die, but you can die because you're sick, or you get shot, or all these other kinds of things. So they understand that there are multiple causes that can lead to this. There's been some more recent kinds of attempts to try to understand what's known as non-corporal continuity. And this is this idea that do children think that there's something that remains after death? And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So basically, most of the current view thinks that, or argues, most of the researchers argue that children have a much better understanding of death, even as young as 3 and 4. But the other thing, and this is some work that I did with Simone, is that you do find that there are lots of misconceptions about death. And these are based on parents' reports, that death is restricted to non-humans, death is viewed by children as sleeping forever, and some notion of continuity after death. And I'll come back to those. One of the issues I have with all the sort of much of the previous work on children's understanding of death is that from the cognitive development perspective, it's looking at it as a purely biological phenomena. But in our society, very few people treat death as purely a biological phenomena. Somewhere between 85 to 95% of the country believe in God or have some kind of religious belief. Death is often thought about from a religious context. And I think if we ignore that particular input, then we're kind of ignoring a lot about what's going on. And if you go back and you look at some of the misconceptions that parents talk about, well, a lot of those could be related to an alternative view and a religious view, and so calling those misconceptions is perhaps not appropriate. And the other thing is that most of the research is focused on primarily Western cultures. And I'm going to argue that we look at death in a very different way than some other cultures, and that's an important thing to kind of think about when we're trying to understand how children think about these things. So the other thing is how might children learn from death? A lot of the research in cognitive development has focused on just how children kind of acquire knowledge by observation and picking things up. But Paul Harris and Melissa Koenig have also argued that there are particular kinds of areas where children have to learn from testimony and other kinds of things. And that's particular places where a lot of things aren't kind of observable. And death is kind of one of those places, right? So you can't really observe what happens after somebody dies for the most part. And so the idea is that maybe this is one area where testimony of parents may be a very important thing. One of the things I'm going to argue is that obviously cultural input is also very important. So one of the things that we've done is try to kind of look at just what children pick up from the culture. And do parents really talk much about death, and what information do they convey? Spent a lot of time looking at cartoons and other kinds of things, and also looking at various kinds of movies and other things. I don't know if anybody has seen this book or this movie, Grace is Gone. It actually captures to me a lot what how our culture deals with death. It's basically also kind of mirrors what Philip Aries said about the U.S. don't want to expose their children to death and want to shield them from death. This movie basically starts out, John Cusack is a stay-at-home dad. He's got 2 daughters, and he has a wife who is basically over in Iraq, and a soldier. And she is killed, and he answers the door, and I think there's 2 Marines telling him that his wife has died. And what he then does is he's a kind of an emotional wreck. He picks his kids up from school and doesn't tell them what happened, and drives them across the country to their favorite amusement park. And the movie takes place over like a week's time. And during that time, he fakes phone calls to his dead wife. He does all sorts of stuff. And to me, it's kind of an exaggerated version of what we often do in this culture, which is try to avoid death and act like it doesn't happen. There are quite a few movies that have this kind of theme within them. There's I think it's Raising Helen, where there's a turtle that dies, and the Helen, who I think is the mom in that, or the stepmom in taking care of her sister's kids, who the sister died in a car accident. Helen basically replaces the turtle with what she thinks is an identical turtle, but the kids had marked something on the bottom of the turtle that Helen never picked up. So the kids knew that they'd replaced the turtle, but Helen was thinking she was doing something positive. This is just a cartoon that kind of captures it. Basically, Satchel, who's kind of a somewhat clueless dog, basically, comes out and says, he's found this fly. It's the laziest fly ever. He hasn't moved in hours. I'm going to call him Pokey the Fly. Rob, the guy, says, dude, you might want to call him Croaky. Rob, he's a fly, not a frog. Ha ha. Satchel, that fly's not lazy. It's passed on. No, he's right here. He's just tiny. The cat comes in. The cat's not really that friendly. Satchel, that fly is gone to a better place, and Satchel says, why would a fly need to go to San Diego? And then the cat comes out and says it's dead. This is a lot. This captures actually how a lot of parents in our study talk about death, and it captures a lot of the way that we're afraid to use the word death in many ways. This is actually another one that captures actually something identical to one of our parents. As a child says, Mom, does everyone die? Oh, sure, we all die sometime. And then the child shows this strong reaction. What's wrong about this cartoon is actually children don't show these kinds of strong reactions. This is something that parents are really kind of putting on children. But then the mom says, Emma, don't worry, it'll be ages until you have your whole life, and you don't have to die if you don't want to, okay? And the idea that the parent has actually solved these problems. So we actually had a parent in our study that said more or less the same thing. We also had a good friend whose son was actually having a fight with a cousin because the cousin had been brought up that only animals die and humans don't. And our friend's son was arguing with him. And it turned out that the other child's dad was dying of brain cancer. And so the whole idea that, telling your child that these things can't happen is really, I think, a big mistake. Just a shout out to an actually really good book, especially this is actually getting at this issue for adults. Basically, this was Roz Chast wrote this book as her mom was dying, and it's basically trying to talk about how often we have difficulty talking about death with our parents as they die, and that this is a difficult thing for us to talk about. It's actually a pretty powerful book. My wife and her mom kind of read it together as my wife's father was dying, and it just actually helps kind of start conversations, which I think should happen more often. And obviously cultures vary greatly in how they embrace death. It's amazing actually how much variation there is in these kinds of things. We've been particularly focused on Mexico, partly because of the Day of the Dead celebration, and obviously that's where my tie comes from. But the idea, and this is a quote that I really like from Octavio Paz, it basically says the word death is not pronounced in New York and Paris and London because it burns the lips. The Mexican, in contrast, is familiar with death, jokes about it, caresses it, sleeps with it, celebrates it. It's one of his favorite toys and his most steadfast love. A very, very different kind of view than the cartoons and the images that I've talked about. Death is often thought about as the national symbol in Mexico, and Day of the Dead is a national holiday, and in all the public schools they teach about it, and they often build these ofrendas or altars in the public schools and a lot of public places that kind of remember the dead. And so we actually have collected quite a bit of data down there. These are various things that my former student and postdoc collected. She gave me this one about a teacher at the front, and some other kinds of images. Imagine a young parent getting a little feeding set that's all Day of the Dead theme. You couldn't kind of imagine that would happen in this country. I had a really bad bicycle accident, and I bought this particular, it's a ceramic tile, about 2 weeks before my accident, so I'm not quite sure what that means, but I broke a lot of ribs and a collarbone, so I think maybe I'll be careful what I buy in the future. And this is just some examples of the ofrendas. They're often incredibly elaborate in the home. They generally have photographs and images of relatives that have died. Actually, the local paper had a whole article about Day of the Dead this morning, and about one school system that had done a whole special kind of thing about it, and how that it seemed to be a very meaningful thing for the children. There are a lot of things that are on these ofrendas that are important symbolically, and they have particular flowers that have a strong scent. They have foods that give off aromas. They're generally candles. The idea is that the scent of the flowers and the food bring the dead back, and often the flowers are laid out in a pathway to kind of guide the dead relatives to return. The other thing that's very remarkable compared to the U.S. is that in cemeteries, people hold vigils. They have dinner parties. Children play among the graves. They have bands playing. It's a much more kind of vibrant and kind of happy kind of event. And often during the Day of the Dead, which in some parts of Mexico will go for a couple of days, there'll be these really kind of big celebrations, and you don't get the idea that anybody's afraid of a cemetery or that there's this kind of negative kind of stuff about it. So one of the things that we've been trying to look at is basically how parents and preschool teachers think that children can handle this, and I'll talk a little bit about how we went about this in a little bit, and also just to what extent are children cognitively and emotionally capable of dealing with death, and how do we convey this? So we've done a lot of interviews with parents, and we've done a lot of kind of trying to understand the cultures in which children are growing up. This is kind of an overview of what we've done, sort of borrowing a little bit from Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model of development. Basically, at the center we have these child interviews, where we basically interviewed 101 typically developing children. We have parental questionnaires that we had parents fill out. We followed up some of those questionnaires with more in-depth interviews for 10 families that the child had experienced a particular death experience. We had 2 focus groups, one in a laboratory preschool and one in another preschool outside. We interviewed 2 teachers in the school where my daughter went, where they, basically kind of trying to get a better sense of their perspectives on things. We also interviewed 4 clinicians who specialize in dealing with children who have witnessed a death or experienced an important death. One of those was Carol Diener, who was on the faculty at University of Illinois and was also on call for the state troopers. Whenever they came across a situation where a child had been in a car accident and seen their parents die, or they'd seen a murder or those kinds of things, Carol was called in. And so we did these long interviews with clinicians to try to get a sense of what they understood. We also, if you look at the bottom, we did a whole bunch of analysis of children's literature that I'll talk about in a minute. We also looked at books that deal with death. These are really strange books, and I'll get to them in a minute. So we really tried to do a whole bunch of things. We also basically did a initial study of Mexican Americans, partly because we wanted to do kind of a pilot study before we actually launched a study in Mexico. So we have a relatively small of about 27 families, Mexican-American families, where we interviewed children and parents. And then actually had a graduate student that went to Mexico for 6 months and participated in Day of the Dead celebrations over 3 years. So that's kind of what we're doing. These are some of the people that are involved in all the work, so I just wanted to call them out. Original the two other people that started originally with me were Peggy Miller, who's now retired from University of Illinois, and Isabel Gutierrez, who's fluent in Spanish and grew up in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is a little bit different than Mexico, both the language and the culture, and so it was kind of interesting for her as well. David Menendez and Matthew Jang are both graduate students that are continuing to work on aspects of this various research program. So we did a mixture of all different kinds of things. So one of the things, if you look at my work overall, is I tend to use a lot of different methods. And one of the things I wasn't particularly satisfied in the previous literature is that the cognitive development stuff is really kind of very cut and dried and sort of abstract, and is kind of ignoring a lot of kinds of things related to emotions and other stuff. And also, I think it doesn't really get at this kind of larger context and fabric of stuff. And so we really tried to do that in this project. And we also really tried to look both at cognitive and affective components, and usually people look at one or the other. And we also had a lot of data from children and their parents. So let me talk a little bit about the children's literature. So basically what we did was we did a pretty kind of wide search for books that children might come across. And we picked Caldecott winners because they're supposed to be great books, and we looked at Caldecott winners from all the way back from 1938 to 2004. We in our parent survey, we asked children what their 3 favorite books were, and then we tracked down those books and we did an analysis of all of those. And we ended up with 198 books, and of all those books, only 6 of them have any mention of death at all. And the ones that do, the death is really kind of peripheral. So, yeah.
Is that only human death or also
all kinds of death. So so it's just not there. And one of the things we didn't look at fairy tales. And fairy tales obviously have a lot of death in them, but they're also been sanitized over time. And if you think about even like Bambi the movie, the death happens off screen. There's a shot and you never see the mom. And even in the Disney movies, there are often central characters that die, like a dad or a mom, but it usually happened before the story starts, or it happens off the screen as well. So there's a way that even in those, there's some shielding of death as well. So basically the idea is that in books that parents typically read to children and present to children, death isn't there for the most part. And interestingly, in our surveys, parents often talk about how they shield their children from death. There are a couple of parents that said, whenever we've come across a death in a storybook, we just skip those pages. So even if it is there, it's often kind of skipped over. Then we did this, and I already mentioned that these are kind of strange. If you can still find a bookstore and you go into a bookstore, you'll generally find that there's a couple of shelves or a bookcase that's devoted to books to read to your child or present to your child when the child has experienced the death of a loved one. These are pretty strange, and we got 103 examples of those. We got them from the library, we got them from a children's literature center. We did a pretty kind of exhaustive search, and then we coded these books in all different ways as well. They're incredibly variable. They often don't use humans in these books at all. They view death from very different perspectives. Some from purely biological perspectives, some from religious, some from spiritual, some from magical. They're often mixed and confusing, and they often reinforce different kinds of misconceptions, like sleep is going to a better place, death is going to a better place, or death is just like sleeping for a very long time. So one of the take-home messages is that don't wait until your child or a child has experienced death to go out and buy one of these books. And that would be a mistake, and part of the reason is the mistake is that it's very unlikely that any of these books will reinforce the same beliefs that you might have in your family about what happens after you die. These are just some of the examples. Fish in a Pocket. Turns out that no children are really upset when a fish dies. They actually get really excited. We had a couple parents that talked about how their children really looked forward to their fish dying because the dad would then flush it down the toilet and they would watch that all. Cat Heaven. So Max the Happy Caterpillar, Freddie the Leaf. Actually, when I gave this talk out at Children's Hospital, they love this book. But it turns out that children have a greater difficulty understanding death in plants, because if you think about weeds and what happens over seasons, it sort of provides children with kind of a different message about death. If a leaf dies, the plant's still alive. And so what is the message that conveys? And also, if you're thinking about using these books for 3.5 to 4-year-olds, they're kind of strange analogies that you're asking children to do. And these are just an example. There was another one that had to do with a robot dying, and it's not exactly, it was just a very strange story. Somebody gave it to our daughter, just as a children's book, and it was just a very strange book. So I would generally avoid most of these. I just don't think they're very useful. So we picked up a lot of parent and child data. This is just giving you some ideas about what goes on. We've got a lot of demographic data, picked up a lot of data about religious practices and beliefs. We also kind of look at how parents kind of view themselves, whether they view themselves as scientific and rational or religious and spiritual. We ask them a lot of beliefs about how they should raise their children and whether they should shield children from death and whether they should protect them from death. And we asked them a lot about children's questions and how they answered, and both hypothetical questions and actual ones. So we collected a lot of information. And then we had these interviews, and we basically had to embed our death interview in a larger interview because the local IRB didn't want us to ask questions about death to children, which just to me basically reinforces this notion that we don't want to talk about death and we think that children can't handle it. Probably one of my take-home messages is adults in our culture can't handle it. Children are fine. And so what we did was we embedded the death interview in a larger interview that looked about children's understanding of life and life processes. What is it? What things are alive? What does it mean to be alive? And those kinds of things. And then I'll show you in the next one. The other thing that we did that's very different from anybody else is that most of the time people just ask what happens when you die without any person, or what happens when a plant dies, or what happens when a dog dies. And there's this real strange study by a guy named Jesse Bering that has two puppets, an alligator and a mouse, and the alligator eats the mouse, and then he asks all these questions about the death of the mouse. For a 3-year-old child to represent these two puppets as real living things is kind of a strange way to go about it. So what we were trying to do in this interview was try to make it as kind of close to the child as we could without kind of really overwhelming them. So basically what we did was we used a picture of a child who was matched by age and gender, and we said, here's Terry. And then we said, basically, Terry has an aunt, and Terry's aunt has died. And then we asked a whole series of questions about what that meant and other kinds of things. And then we went on and said, well, Terry had a pet, and Terry's pet died. And then we asked all these questions about the pet. And then we had a plant, and we asked all these questions about Terry's plant that had died, okay? And then after all of that, we turned it around and basically started asking some things about life properties as well. So that's embedded in the middle. The interviews took about 25 minutes. One of the things, if you think about all these researchers or all these people that think children are afraid of death and that this is going to be too hard for them, in the 101 children we asked, there was only one child that was uncomfortable, and so we skipped that part of this part of the interview. All the other children had no difficulty at all and showed no kind of overall kind of emotional response. Mexican American children, sort of same thing, same kind of stuff. We modified the interview a little bit and had researchers that were fluent in Spanish, and we basically did a lot of things, including changing the photograph so that it matched more with the sample that we did. And this is the same kinds of photographs that we used when we went down to Mexico as well. So a little bit Mexican sample. We went down to Puebla, and this is an area of Mexico that 95% Roman Catholic. Day of the Dead is kind of a celebration, is kind of a blurring of Catholicism with indigenous beliefs. Most of the individuals in this particular area have some kind of indigenous kind of history and stuff. So we basically interviewed preschool children. We've got mothers, fathers, and grandmothers, and pretty much did sort of the same study that we've done in the U.S. We're still kind of processing this data, but I'll talk a little bit about it. Just to give you some idea of parents, if you look at these two different cultures, parent talk to children about death. The European Americans are a lot indirect in how they talk about it. They're very avoidant. They often provide very vague kinds of things in response to children's questions. A lot of it's basically they're trying to shield children from death, and they're not trying to kind of answer questions about it directly. The Mexican families are much more direct, they're much more straightforward, they're much more factual in their overall responses. And kind of a common theme that comes through the Mexican data is that the parents really feel like they need to help children embrace death so they understand it and they're kind of prepared for it. Interestingly, Peggy Miller's done a whole bunch of work on children and parents basically shielding children from violence, and she did some interesting work in inner city Baltimore and North Shore of Chicago. And in North Shore of Chicago, basically parents try to shield their kids from violence and act like it never happens. Inner city Baltimore, they basically say, we need to prepare these children for a violent world. And they talk openly about it and how to prepare it for it. And I think that's kind of more sort of what we see in the Mexican and the U.S. sample for the most part. Here's some of the Europeans. This is basically looking at questions about a pet mouse in the family that had died, and the parent says, well, the mouse went to someplace happy. I'm not sure if that's San Diego or not. There was another situation where a family had a nanny, and the nanny was killed in a car accident, and the mother told the child that she's sleeping and that we won't be able to see her or talk to her because she won't be able to come and play anymore. And interestingly, the child responded, well, then maybe the nanny needs a Snow White kiss because, Snow White is sleeping and then that kiss will wake her up. So again, sort of how these kind of misconceptions get played out and how the content of what children see in movies and other places and how parents talk about it actually influences how they reason about them. Here's a Mexican parent, and one of the things that Isabel did was she asked parents to respond to the quote of Octavio Paz, and so that you'll see some kinds of relation there. And the Mexican parent said, we laugh about death, we're not afraid of it. When you're about to die, sometimes since we're ill, we'll say that the Jesuita, the bony one, is already coming for us. We start making thousands of jokes. Coming to the conclusion of death is painful, but we know that it's a step to a better afterlife. As Mexicans, we hug death, we accept it in the same way we make fun of it. A very, very different kind of view. Basically, if you've got someone in your family that looks like they're going to die, we don't sit around making lots of jokes about it. And if anything, we're often afraid to talk to that person directly. Here's another one, Mexican parent, death is so natural, it's a stage of our lives, we can't cover something that's unavoidable. Playing with our own lives is a painful risk, we don't know how much pain we can cause other people. Death, it is something that's unavoidable. So again, a very different view. We also asked a lot about the importance for Day of the Dead. It serves as a way to remember, worship, and celebrate those that have died. It's a tradition that's been passed from generation to generation. It's a time of year when the dead come to visit and living do things to receive them. So it's kind of a very important celebration in Mexico. One of the things is that doing cross-cultural work, we're never actually free of cultural, kind of invasions. And if you look at the Day of the Dead celebrations, you see that some of the Halloween kinds of traditions have carried over, and they're becoming more interwoven and interconnected. And we did this study about 10 years ago, and there have been some even rapid changes. I don't know if any of you went and saw the Spectre movie of James Bond. I doubt it because of the demographic of this audience, but you did see it? Did you see this part? Okay. Well, so it starts out actually with the Day of the Dead parade and in Mexico City. And they've never had a Day of the Dead parade until this year. It's not an open parade like that in Mexico City. Often what you'll do is you'll have children going around from house to house with little skulls that they use to collect candy and stuff that are given out. But there usually is not a formal parade. But now, because basically Mexico City decided that they could use it as a tourist attraction, they now have this really large Day of the Dead celebration that happened for the first parade, which happened for the first time this year. So it'll be interesting to see how this impacts the culture and things as well, but it's just another example of kind of bringing things out. And, quite frankly, even in our culture, we're seeing a lot of the Day of the Dead kinds of things. I know most of you don't have ties like this, but, Collectivo Coffee has, I'm a coffee addict, has these images as part of their coffee house, right? And the Day of the Dead images are basically beginning to permeate our culture as well, and especially in parts of the southern U.S. and New Mexico and those places. So basically, if one of the things that we tried to do was kind of characterize what we thought were folk theories that were present by parents and teachers. And quite frankly, the preschool teachers held very similar views to the parents in our study. So when we did the focus groups and we looked at how they said it, they basically felt that children should be shielded from death, that children before the age of about 9 were really incapable of understanding death, and that they tried their best to not talk about it and to shield them from death, with the basic idea that children lack the emotional and cognitive capacity to handle death. In contrast, the Mexicans basically really said children need to be familiar with it. That's the healthy thing to do. And it's also the idea is that this is a way to remember the people that you've loved and to carry on their memories. And they also sort of argued that this was part of the psychological and spiritual well-being of the child. This is just showing there is some differences in the U.S. In terms of, if you look at children's experience with death as reported by their parents, the children that we came across in Mexico basically are getting, the parents report more kind of death experiences for children. And obviously, especially if you look at Day of the Dead, because most of the kids participate in the celebration. But if you look here, about 30% of the parents in the U.S. said their children have not experienced it. And, interestingly, if you drive around town or you ride your bicycle, you see squirrels that have died on a daily basis. So there are actually lots of opportunities for parents to talk about what it means when something dies. So the child interviews, basically these are looking at the U.S. and Mexico in terms of these basic sub-concepts. And if you're basically the lighter color is U.S. sample, and this is basically a perfect score would be a 2 on these. It's based on an average of a number of different kinds of questions, and what you can see is causality generally develops a little, and universality seems to develop a little bit later, but that there's differences between the Mexican children and the U.S. children in how they reason about universality and non-functionality. If you look at them attributions of living things, basically in the Mexican Americans, if you look at whether they have particular kinds of biological, psychological properties, the Mexican children think that a lot of these properties continue after death, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Children in Mexico are part of the Day of the Dead celebration. They're actually socialized to participate in it. They participate in building the ofrendas at home. They participate in going to the market to buy the materials for the ofrendas. They often help build the ofrendas, and they often go to the cemeteries and participate in it. This is actually one of the things that's kind of interesting, is that a lot of children basically knew or experienced the dead relative had returned. And we asked them sort of, how did you know that? And if you look here, about 55% of the children said they actually perceived or they talked to the dead person, or they kind of witnessed that individual in some way or another. I mentioned testimony earlier, only about 15% said it's because my mom and dad said the dead person had returned. A lot of children, about 20% of the children said that it's just because of the basic facts. It's Day of the Dead, we made an ofrenda, that means they came. Interestingly, for the perceived dead, often what parents, my assumption is parents will take bites out of the food that are on the table, and that's one of the things that children perceive as evidence for the return. But we did have quite a few say that they saw and physically talked to a dead relative had returned. So we also kind of looked at the emotional kind of thing, and one of the things we find is that emotions associated with the Day of the Dead kind of change over time. So about 50% of the children actually think of this as a kind of a happy or fun time, and this is something we see increase from about 3.5 to 5 or 6, where children become thinking about Day of the Dead as a really kind of happy time to remember relatives. The opposite happens with fear. So some of the youngest children are scared, and then it tends to decrease with older children. Just a few children say that they're sad and don't understand it. So there is kind of an appropriate emotional kind of understanding here. So I already mentioned this is traditionally thought that children fear death. I think, again, that the notion that children fear death or they have anxiety about death is, I think, primarily based on clinical populations where children are pretty anxious about it, and I bet their parents are very anxious about it as well. In general, children in the U.S. don't seem to be that. Most of the children seem to be quite interested in the interview and had no difficulty kind of talking about it. And actually, a lot of parents report that their children ask questions about death. And the other thing is that most children had a kind of appropriate script for what happens when you die, though I'll provide you some data in a minute that suggests that sometimes that script is a little bit different than we might like. And that's what this is. So one of the things we did was we asked children at the end of the interview about, or the death part of the interview, is what Terry's parents should tell Terry about the death of Terry's aunt. And what you can see is that at the top here is reassurance. So they could reassure that it's okay, and that kind of increases. We have a fair number of people that just think they should go replace Terry's aunt. Not a great, it's sort of like the turtle in Raising Helen movie. Imagine if your spouse has died, and the idea is, we can just replace that spouse, right, and everything will be fine. That's kind of an interesting model. One thing that you see is that actually as children are getting older, they want parents to basically provide more facts about what happened, to tell the truth about it. And we also see a decrease in this kind of don't know response. So over this period of time, children are kind of understanding more about kind of death, and they really want the facts. So basically, parents and preschool teachers tend to underestimate what children know about death quite a bit, and that we think they underestimate their emotional capacity as well. And that colors the way that they interact with children in the classrooms. It colors the way that parents interact with children in everyday life. And there are really clear differences in how children in Mexico are raised about death compared to the U.S. And it's clear that parents in Mexico are much more comfortable with it. Now, when I gave these talks out at Children's Hospital in Seattle, it was to a whole bunch of chaplains. And the chaplains, a number of them worked with Mexican American families. And they thought that I was painting too rosy a picture of the Mexican model. And they were dealing with parents and families that dealing with children that are dying and were really traumatized. And so one of the things I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about is exactly, one of the implications of this work is that potentially children who are raised in a culture where parents talk about death and the children are socialized to understand death and to understand the emotions around death, that it might be a little bit easier for them to cope with death. Now that's a very difficult kind of thing to study, because you basically need to go in and start looking at families that are right in the middle of bereavement process. And clearly the IRB isn't going to be that happy with me doing that. And also it's hard to do that in terms of being sensitive to the parents and stuff. And so one of the things that we don't know is basically kind of short-term consequences of being raised in a Mexican culture where you talk about death and a U.S. culture where we kind of shield and act like it doesn't happen. But one of the things that we're trying to look at right now is in a population of adults, and what we're doing is we're asking adults how they remember being socialized about death. Did their parents take them to memorial services or wakes? Did they ever see a dead body as a child? How many deaths did they remember experiencing as a child? Do they remember their parents openly talking about death? And so we've been able to do this as on using a Mechanical Turk on Amazon to basically get a large sample of individuals. And we did one pass over the summer where we collected, I think, something like 600 participants in this study, and we're about to launch another one where we hope to collect about 1,000, where we're also looking kind of more in depth about kind of the emotions around death. And from my own experience, I was clearly shielded from death. I don't think I saw a dead body until I was about 25, and my parents clearly didn't take me to funerals and other kinds of things, and they tried to shield me as much as possible, growing up in a relatively wealthy suburban community in New Jersey that's not that different from the North Shore of Chicago. And quite frankly, as a parent, I wasn't very good at talking to my own children about death. And, one of the things that this particular research has done is really changed the way that I think about how parents should talk to their children. Just a brief kind of view, the preliminary data that we've been collecting really does suggest that if you ask adults how they were socialized about death and how open their parents were about talking about it, that seems to be related to how well those adults think that they cope with the death of a loved one as an adult, and so that they feel like they're better adjusted to that kind of situation. So at least we're collecting some evidence that seems to kind of support this idea that socializing children to be more open about death is actually kind of beneficial in the long run. And again, I'm not sure, I think basically when somebody you really love dies, I think we're all pretty devastated, and I think there's a period of time where we're all in shock and it's a difficult coping thing. But the question is just sort of what's the long-term consequences if we've shielded children or we've acted like it can't happen. And I actually think, even though I'm a cognitive developmentalist, not somebody that focuses a lot on social emotional aspects, I think it's really important for us to kind of embrace these emotions, especially with respect to death. So basically, I think we need to spend more time kind of looking at cultural influences on cognition and cognitive development. I generally think it's a lot better to be open about death and talk about it. I think actually one good strategy for parents are having animals or pets that you can build a strong attachment to, but have relatively short lifespans. And that sounds kind of morbid, but I actually think that having a pet die and talking to your child about what that means And what you think that means in terms of an afterlife and other kinds of religious kinds of stuff is very important. And I also think it's an opportunity for us to kind of think about, how we remember somebody who's died. So I actually think that parents need to reflect a little bit on what they're trying to convey to children and how best to do that. So anyway, thanks very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So, or if I depressed you all. Yeah.
In this very room on